At my husband's 40th birthday celebration, his mother clinked her champagne glass and announced I had been unfaithful for years. The room fell silent. 200 guests turned to stare at me. My husband's hand tightened around his glass until it shattered, and before I could speak, he grabbed my arm and shoved me backward into the dessert table. Cake and champagne splattered across my ivory dress as I hit the floor. I lay there among the ruins of the elaborate display, feeling the cold marble beneath my back. He turned away, already accepting his mother's comforting embrace. That's when I started laughing. Not hysterical laughter. Not broken laughter. A slow, knowing chuckle that rose from my chest and echoed through the stunned ballroom. My husband froze mid-step. His mother's perfectly composed face flickered with something I had waited 3 years to see: fear. The morning had started like any other Saturday in our penthouse overlooking Central Park. Gray November light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows that cost more than most people's houses. I was already awake when my husband emerged from his private bathroom, steam trailing behind him like a ghost. At 40, Marcus still looked like the man who had swept me off my feet at a charity gala 7 years ago. Tall, dark hair silvering at the temples, the kind of jaw that belonged on magazine covers. But his eyes had changed. Where there was once warmth, I now saw only a strange emptiness that appeared after his father's death 3 years ago. "Happy birthday," I said, keeping my voice light. He bent to kiss my cheek. His lips were cool despite the hot shower. "Mother's excited about tonight," he said. The words came out rehearsed, hollow. "I'm sure she is," I thought. But I replied with a practiced smile. "She's outdone herself with the planning." The Plaza Ballroom, 200 guests, that string quartet from Vienna. Marcus nodded, already checking his phone. His fingers moved across the screen in patterns I had memorized over the past 2 years. Quick scrolls meant normal correspondence. Slow, deliberate typing meant he was communicating with his mother. Right now, it was slow and deliberate. "I should get ready for the foundation meeting this morning," I said, rising from our bed. The bed we hadn't shared intimately in 18 months. He didn't look up. "Don't be late tonight. Mother wants us there by 6 for photographs." Of course. I retreated to my dressing room, the only space in our home without the surveillance cameras his mother had insisted we install after a fabricated break-in attempt 2 years ago. I had discovered the hidden devices during a methodical search 6 months later. Tiny lenses embedded in smoke detectors, picture frames, even the antique clock in our bedroom. I left them all functional but had become an expert at feeding them exactly what Eleanor wanted to see. A devoted daughter-in-law, a perfect society wife, a woman completely under control. But in this room, behind a false panel I had installed during a renovation, I kept my real life. 3 burner phones, 2 encrypted laptops. External hard drives containing over 4,000 documents, photographs, and recordings. My insurance policy against the woman who had spent 3 years trying to destroy me. I pressed my thumb against the hidden biometric scanner and the panel slid open. The soft glow of indicator lights greeted me like old friends. For 3 years, I had been building a case that would bring the Ashford dynasty to its knees. Not for revenge, though that would be satisfying. For survival. And for Marcus. The man I had married, who had been slowly erased and replaced by whatever his mother had turned him into. My name is Vivian Chen Ashford. I'm 42 years old, a former federal prosecutor who left the Department of Justice to marry into one of New York's oldest families. When I met Marcus at that charity gala, I thought I had found my person. He was kind, funny, passionate about using his family's wealth for actual good rather than tax write-offs disguised as philanthropy. His mother Eleanor had seemed welcoming at first, the gracious matriarch delighted that her son had found love. The mask slipped exactly 3 weeks after our wedding, when Marcus's father died suddenly of a heart attack. Or what the family doctor called a heart attack. What I later discovered, buried in medical records I obtained through channels that would make my former colleagues uncomfortable, was a lethal injection of potassium chloride administered by the same doctor who signed the death certificate. The same doctor who received a $5 million payment from an Ashford shell company 2 days later. Richard Ashford had been planning to divorce Eleanor. He had discovered what she really was. Not just a controlling socialite, but the architect of a financial empire built on fraud, manipulation, and the systematic destruction of anyone who threatened her control. Including, it seemed, her own husband. After Richard's death, everything changed. Marcus began attending weekly sessions with Dr. Harold Vance, a psychiatrist his mother recommended to help him process grief. Within 6 months, the man I married had become someone I barely recognized. Distant, compliant. His eyes would go vacant during family gatherings, especially when Eleanor whispered in his ear. He started repeating phrases that sounded rehearsed, making decisions that contradicted everything he had ever believed. I noticed the patterns because pattern recognition was my job for 15 years. I prosecuted financial criminals, cult leaders, human traffickers. I knew what psychological manipulation looked like. And I knew, with growing horror, that my husband was being systematically conditioned by his own mother. It started with small things. Marcus suddenly hated restaurants he used to love. He stopped seeing friends his mother disapproved of. He began checking in with Eleanor multiple times a day, calls that left him agitated and confused. Then came the bigger changes. He signed over power of attorney to her. He moved foundation assets into accounts she controlled. He began echoing her opinions, her prejudices, even her speech patterns. The day I found him staring blankly at a video message from his mother, eyes fixed, body rigid, repeating phrases I could barely hear, I knew I had to act. But confrontation would be useless. Eleanor had spent decades perfecting her techniques. Marcus would defend her without even knowing why. And I would become the enemy, isolated and easily eliminated. So I began documenting, recording, investigating. I traced the payments to Dr. Vance, categorized in Ashford accounting as consulting fees but totaling over $2 million over 3 years. I found research papers Dr. Vance had published decades ago on behavioral modification techniques, work that had been denounced by the psychological community but apparently found a wealthy patron. I discovered the shell companies funneling money from the Ashford Foundation into Eleanor's private accounts, the bribes to city officials, the systematic destruction of business competitors through manufactured scandals and legal harassment. And I found the others. Former employees who had tried to expose Eleanor and found themselves unemployable, business partners who had been driven to bankruptcy, a previous daughter-in-law who had died in a suspicious car accident after filing for divorce, a pattern stretching back 40 years, all leading to one conclusion. Eleanor Ashford was a predator who had finally turned her techniques on her own son to ensure complete control of the family empire. I checked my watch. 7:15. Time to become Vivian Chen Ashford again, the devoted wife, the perfect accessory, the woman who suspected nothing. Tonight, at my husband's 40th birthday celebration, Eleanor would spring whatever trap she had been preparing. I had seen the signs over the past month. Secret meetings with her lawyers. Whispered conversations with Marcus that left him more vacant than usual. A new intensity in the way she watched me, as if measuring me for a coffin. But tonight, I would be ready. My contacts at the FBI, cultivated carefully over 3 years, were standing by. My evidence package, assembled with prosecutorial precision, was loaded and waiting on a dead man's switch linked to my phone's accelerometer and GPS. One wrong move, one act of violence, and everything would go live simultaneously to federal authorities, the New York Times, and every major news outlet in the country. I selected a deep burgundy gown for the evening. Eleanor had texted specific instructions for me to wear the pale blue Dior she had gifted me last Christmas. A gift that came with invisible strings, like everything she gave. My choice of burgundy was a small rebellion, but small rebellions had kept me sane while I assembled my case. The Plaza Ballroom glittered like a jewelry box when we arrived. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across 200 guests. New York's elite gathered to celebrate Marcus Ashford's 4th decade of life. Politicians, financiers, society matrons, all people who owed Eleanor favors or feared her wrath. Not one of my former colleagues from the Justice Department had been invited. Not my sister from California. Not my college roommate who now lived in Connecticut. Eleanor had curated the guest list to ensure I would have no allies in the room. She glided toward us the moment we entered, resplendent in silver Chanel, her perfectly preserved face arranged in an expression of maternal warmth that I now recognized as a carefully constructed mask. At 68, Eleanor Ashford remained striking, the kind of woman photographed for society pages and feared in boardrooms. Tonight, her eyes held a particular gleam that made my pulse quicken. "Darling Marcus," she cooed, embracing her son. "And Vivian, She turned to me, her gaze flickering to my burgundy gown. I expected the blue. I wanted to surprise everyone, I replied, matching her saccharine tone. Something flickered behind her eyes. Displeasure, quickly masked. She linked her arm through mine and led me through the crowd, pointing out important guests as if I couldn't identify every corrupt official and compromised judge myself. Senator Morrison, Judge Blackwell, Police Commissioner Hartford, all on the Ashford payroll in ways that would be very interesting to federal investigators. The cocktail hour passed in a blur of air kisses and hollow congratulations. I circulated carefully, playing my role while tracking the movements of three specific people. Eleanor, who never strayed far from Marcus. Dr. Vance, who had positioned himself near the main stage with a direct line of sight to my husband, and a silver-haired man I didn't recognize, who had arrived late and immediately entered into intense conversation with Eleanor's personal attorney. I drifted closer, using the crowd for cover. The documentation is complete, the attorney was saying. Once the announcement is made tonight, we can proceed with the conservatorship filing Monday morning. And if she contests? The silver-haired man asked. Eleanor has video evidence that should make any contest inadvisable. The attorney's smile made my skin crawl. Mrs. Chen Ashford's history of instability will be well documented by then. I understood then. Tonight wasn't just about humiliation. Eleanor was planning to have me declared mentally unfit, to strip away my legal standing so thoroughly that any accusations I might make would be dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed woman. The affair announcement was just the opening salvo, designed to create a public record of my alleged betrayal before the real legal assault began. My phone buzzed silently. A message from my FBI contact. Standing by. Ready when you are. I typed back. Hold for my signal. May need evidentiary support tonight. The dinner bell chimed, and guests began moving toward their assigned tables. I found my seat next to Marcus, directly across from Dr. Vance. Eleanor commanded the head of the table like a queen on her throne, her eyes constantly tracking me, cataloging my every expression. Before we begin our meal, Eleanor announced, tapping her champagne flute with a silver knife, I want to share how proud I am of my son. 40 years of carrying the Ashford legacy with grace and dignity. Marcus smiled mechanically. I noticed his left hand tapping a pattern against the tablecloth, the same pattern I had documented dozens of times. A stress response, triggered by his mother's proximity. Marriage is sacred, Eleanor continued, her gaze sliding to me. That's why it pains me to share what I've recently discovered about the woman my son calls wife. The room fell silent. 200 faces turned toward me with predatory interest. For 3 years, Eleanor said, her voice dripping with rehearsed sorrow, I have protected my son from the truth. But I can no longer stay silent. She pulled out her phone and held it up, showing a photograph I recognized instantly because I had been there when it was taken. My former colleague from the Justice Department, Michael Torres, hugging me at his wife's birthday party last March. A friendly embrace between old friends twisted by angle and context into something sordid. Vivian has been unfaithful. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I watched Marcus's face, saw the programmed response kick in. His jaw tightened. His eyes went flat. Eleanor leaned close to him, her lips brushing his ear. Remember your duty, she whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. Protect what's ours. Marcus turned to me, and for a moment, I saw genuine confusion in his eyes. The real man, buried under layers of conditioning, struggling to surface. Then it was gone, replaced by cold certainty. Is this true? He demanded, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom. Marcus, listen to me carefully, I said, keeping my voice steady. That photograph was taken at Michael's wife's 40th birthday party. I can prove it. Your mother has manipulated every piece of evidence she's showing you. Liar, Eleanor hissed. Her mask was slipping, her desperation showing. I have documentation. Witnesses. Your betrayal ends tonight, Vivian. Then Marcus grabbed my arm and shoved. The force sent me stumbling backward into the dessert table. Crystal and china shattered around me as I crashed to the floor. Champagne soaked through my burgundy gown as I lay among the ruins of a 5-tier cake. The silence was absolute. 200 members of New York society stared in frozen shock at the heir to the Ashford fortune standing over his wife like an executioner. I felt the impact register on my phone's sensors. My dead man's switch was armed. One more verified trigger, and everything would go live. But I didn't need the automatic system. I had everything I needed right here, right now. I started laughing. It began as a chuckle, soft and knowing, rising from my chest like bubbles in champagne. Marcus froze mid-step. His mother's face went pale beneath her perfect makeup. The sound grew, echoing through the silent ballroom, carrying every ounce of bitter triumph I had kept hidden for 3 years. Perfect, I said, rising to my feet. Absolutely perfect. I brushed cake from my gown, not caring about the ruined silk. Thank you, Eleanor. You couldn't have set this up better if you tried. Confusion clouded Eleanor's face. This wasn't in her script. The humiliated wife was supposed to cry, plead, maybe make wild accusations that would support the instability narrative. She was not supposed to laugh. What are you talking about? Eleanor demanded, her voice losing its cultured smoothness. I'm talking about the fact that everyone in this room just witnessed your son commit assault. I turned to address the crowd, falling into courtroom rhythms I had perfected over 15 years. You all just watched Marcus Ashford, under his mother's direct instruction, physically attack his wife. On camera. She gestured to the dozens of smartphones still raised in shock. In front of 200 witnesses. She's clearly unhinged, Eleanor sputtered. Marcus, help your wife, she needs medical attention, she's having some kind of episode. But Marcus wasn't moving. He was staring at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. His eyes had lost their flat emptiness, replaced by something I hadn't seen in 3 years. Confusion. Horror. The man underneath the programming, fighting to surface. What did I just, he whispered. Vivian. I don't. Why did I? I turned back to Eleanor, watching fear bloom across her features. Check your phones, I announced to the crowd. Some of you may have received an email in the last 30 seconds. The others will receive it within the hour. The first notification chime sounded from somewhere in the back of the room. Then another. Then a cascade of pings and buzzes as my evidence package began arriving in inboxes across the ballroom. What is this? Judge Blackwell demanded, staring at his phone with a face gone gray. Evidence, I replied calmly. 3 years of documentation proving that Eleanor Ashford orchestrated the murder of her husband Richard. That she has been systematically conditioning her son Marcus through a psychiatrist named Harold Vance using techniques classified as psychological torture. That the Ashford Foundation has laundered approximately $400 million through fraudulent charitable programs. And that many of you, I swept my gaze across the panicking crowd, have been complicit in covering up her crimes. Dr. Vance had begun edging toward the exit. I called out to him directly. Dr. Vance, you might want to stay. The FBI agents arriving in the lobby will have questions about the research you've been conducting on Marcus. I believe the technical term is coercive psychological programming, the same techniques used on prisoners of war. Applied to a patient without consent for 3 years. Vance froze. His clinical detachment had vanished, replaced by the panicked calculation of a man realizing his carefully constructed alibis were crumbling. This is insane, Eleanor said, but her voice had lost its power. She's fabricating everything. Marcus, tell them your wife is a liar. But Marcus had sunk into a chair, his head in his hands. His body shook with tremors as years of suppressed memories began breaking through. The sessions, he muttered. The videos. The words she made me repeat. I couldn't think, I couldn't choose, everything she said felt true even when I knew it wasn't. That's the conditioning breaking down, I said gently, kneeling beside him despite the ache where I had hit the floor. Your mother and Dr. Vance have been programming your responses since your father's death. The technique involves medication, repetitive verbal commands, and punishment for independent thought. My father, Marcus said suddenly, his eyes meeting mine. You said his death. What really happened to my father? Silence fell over the ballroom again. Eleanor's face contorted with something between rage and terror. Your father discovered what your mother really was, I said. He was going to divorce her, take control of the foundation, expose her financial crimes. So she had him killed. Dr. Jameson, the family physician, administered a lethal injection. The payment records are in the evidence package I just distributed. Lies! Eleanor screamed, finally losing her composure completely. This ungrateful woman has corrupted my son, destroyed our family name, and now you're all believing her fantasy. The ballroom doors opened. 4 people in dark suits entered, moving with the efficient calm of federal law enforcement. I recognized Agent Patricia Reyes in the lead, my primary contact who had been patiently assembling a federal case based on my intelligence for the past 18 months. Eleanor Ashford, Agent Reyes announced, "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. You have the right to remain silent. Do you know who I am?" Eleanor demanded as agents approached her. "I will destroy you. I will destroy all of you. We know exactly who you are," Agent Reyes replied. "That's why we're here." I watched as they handcuffed Eleanor, her silver Chanel gown incongruous against the metal restraints. Dr. Vance was being detained near the exit, his protests about patient confidentiality ignored. Several guests were attempting to slip away, only to find more agents blocking the doors, taking names, securing devices. Marcus sat motionless through all of it, staring at his mother as if seeing her for the first time. "All those years," he said finally. "Everything I thought I believed. Everything I thought I felt. Was any of it real?" I touched his arm carefully, not sure how he would react. "The beginning was real," I said honestly. "When we met, when we fell in love, before your father died. That was you. The real you." She tried to erase that person, but she failed. "You're still in there, Marcus." "I hurt you," he whispered, horror washing over his face as he finally processed what he had done. "In front of everyone. I attacked my own wife. You were responding to a trigger," I explained. "A command she programmed into you years ago. Your conscious mind had no control. That's what the evidence will show, and that's what will hopefully help you avoid criminal charges for what happened tonight." He looked at me with the first genuine emotion I had seen from him in 3 years. "Why did you stay? Why didn't you just leave when you realized what was happening?" I considered the question, one I had asked myself countless times during those long nights documenting Eleanor's crimes. "Because I loved who you were before she got to you," I said finally. "And because I couldn't let her do to anyone else what she did to you. Your father. Her first daughter-in-law. All the employees she destroyed. Someone had to stop her." Marcus's mother was being led toward the exit now, her protests growing more desperate. The elegant ballroom had transformed into a crime scene, guests giving statements, phones being collected as evidence, the elaborate birthday celebration reduced to chaos. The man I had hired to photograph our reconciliation story would be capturing very different images tonight. Tomorrow's papers would lead with the Ashford downfall, not the anniversary they had never intended to celebrate. 8 months later, I sat in a federal courtroom watching Eleanor Ashford receive her sentence. Gone were the designer clothes and perfect makeup. She wore orange and defiance, still believing somehow that her money and connections would save her. They didn't. 34 years. The judge's voice carried across the packed courtroom. For conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, fraud, money laundering, and a host of lesser charges, she would be nearly 100 before she was eligible for parole. Dr. Vance had turned state's evidence within weeks of his arrest, trading detailed testimony about his conditioning techniques for a reduced sentence. His records proved invaluable in understanding what had been done to Marcus and in building the case against Eleanor. He would serve 12 years and lose his medical license permanently. The Ashford Foundation had been dissolved, its legitimate charitable functions transferred to new organizations with proper oversight. The fraudulent assets, nearly $500 million traced to offshore accounts and shell companies, were being redistributed to the victims Eleanor had spent decades destroying. Former employees who had lost careers, business partners driven to bankruptcy. The family of Richard Ashford's first daughter-in-law, whose death was being reinvestigated. And Marcus. I found him waiting outside the courthouse, thinner than before, wearing casual clothes instead of the tailored suits his mother had always insisted upon. He had spent 6 months in a residential treatment program specializing in recovery from coercive control. The progress had been slow, painful, and ultimately transformative. "It's over," he said as I approached. "The trial is," I agreed. "The rest is just beginning." We walked together toward the park, finding a bench overlooking the river. The late spring sun was warm, and I was reminded of the day we met, nearly 8 years ago. "A different lifetime. My therapist says I need to stop apologizing," Marcus said. "But I don't know how to not feel responsible for what happened to you. What I did to you. You were as much a victim as anyone," I said. I've said it before, and I'll keep saying it until you believe it. Your mother weaponized you. The person who pushed me that night wasn't you, but the person who didn't notice what she was doing to me for years, he said quietly. The person who let her isolate you, control our lives, make you feel so alone you had to become a one-woman investigation unit just to survive. That person was me. Before the conditioning got bad. I should have seen it sooner. We've been through this, I reminded him. We were both manipulated. We both survived. What matters now is what we do next. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the boats on the river. The foundation, he said finally. The real one, the new one being established from the recovered assets. I've been asked to be on the advisory board, helping identify other victims of coercive control, funding research into recovery programs, supporting people trying to escape situations like mine. That sounds perfect for you. I want to do more than that, he said, turning to meet my eyes. I want to tell my story. Publicly. So that other people, other men especially, understand that this can happen to anyone. That psychological abuse doesn't look the way we think it does. That you can be successful, intelligent, privileged, and still be completely controlled by someone you're supposed to trust. It won't be easy, I warned him. People will doubt you. They'll say you should have known, should have fought back. I know. He smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since his father's death. But you taught me that truth has power, even when it's ugly. Even when it makes you vulnerable. You spent 3 years building a case that everyone said was impossible. Against people everyone said were untouchable. If you could do that, I can tell my story. We sat in comfortable silence as the afternoon light shifted across the water. The question of our marriage remained unresolved, something neither of us was ready to address. Too much had happened, too much healing remained to be done, but there was something between us still, something that had survived years of manipulation and trauma. I resigned from the foundation board last week, I told him. I'm starting a new organization. Legal advocacy for victims of coercive control. Pro bono representation for people trying to escape abusive family systems. Of course you are, Marcus said, and I heard warmth in his voice. Real warmth, not the programmed pleasantries of the past 3 years. You never could stop fighting for people. Someone has to. He reached out and took my hand, the first voluntary physical contact between us since his recovery began. I didn't pull away. Whatever happens with us, he said carefully, whatever we decide about the future, I want you to know that what you did, staying when you could have left, fighting when you could have walked away, it saved my life. Not just legally. Not just physically. You gave me a chance to become a real person again. I squeezed his hand gently. That's all any of us can do, I said. Give each other chances. We stayed on that bench as the sun set over the river, 2 survivors of the same storm, finding our way back to shore. The path ahead was uncertain. Healing would take years, maybe decades. But for the first time since I had discovered the truth about Eleanor Ashford, I felt something like hope. 6 months later, the Marcus Ashford Foundation for Psychological Freedom held its inaugural gala. Not at the plaza, not with Eleanor's curated guest list of corrupt officials and society predators. We chose a community center in Brooklyn, invited survivors and advocates from across the country, and served coffee and homemade desserts instead of champagne and caviar. Marcus spoke publicly for the first time about his experience. His voice shook at first, describing the sessions with Dr. Vance, the way his thoughts and feelings had been systematically replaced with programmed responses. But it steadied as he talked about recovery, about the slow process of discovering who he actually was beneath the conditioning. I watched from the back of the room as people approached him afterward. Men and women who recognized their own experiences in his story. Family members who finally understood what had happened to someone they loved. Professionals who worked with survivors of coercive control, grateful for the visibility his story would bring. He found me later, exhausted but lighter than I had ever seen him. That was harder than I expected, he admitted. But also more important, I felt like I was actually helping. You were, I assured him. You are. He hesitated, then asked the question that had been hanging between us for months. What about us, Vivian? Where do we go from here? I had thought about this constantly, weighing obligation against healing, shared history against the need for fresh starts. The truth was, I loved who Marcus was becoming. Not the man his mother had created. Not even entirely the man I had married. But the person emerging from the wreckage, thoughtful and vulnerable and finally, genuinely his own. I don't know, I said honestly. I think we need more time. More healing. But I don't want to close any doors either. He nodded, accepting this. Maybe that's enough for now, he said. Not closing doors. Maybe it is. I thought about Eleanor, serving her sentence in a federal facility upstate. About the empire she had built on manipulation and fear, now dismantled and redistributed to the people she had harmed. About the years I had spent fighting in secret, never knowing if it would work, never certain I would survive. What had started as a desperate bid for survival had become something larger. A foundation that would help thousands, a story that would validate countless experiences. A relationship that might, eventually, find its way back to something real. The woman who had laughed on the floor of the plaza ballroom, covered in champagne and cake and 3 years of accumulated rage, hadn't known what the future held. She had only known that truth was worth fighting for, even when the powerful seemed invincible. Now I knew the rest. Truth doesn't just expose lies. It creates possibilities. Space for healing, for growth, for becoming whoever you were meant to be before someone tried to make you into something else. Eleanor Ashford had spent her life controlling others. In the end, she had created the conditions for her own destruction. And in the chaos of her fall, something unexpected had grown. Hope. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank each of you for being part of this incredible journey. If you're enjoying these stories of empowerment, consider subscribing. It's completely free and helps us build this amazing community. Let's continue.